reach me. So if you need to ask a question or offer a comment, you're going to have to speak up. I do have some of the latest and greatest hearing aids, but people who sit right on the back row, you're going to have to speak up nevertheless. We're a couple of minutes early, and so I think we'll start and we'll make the latecomers really late. The title of the lesson series is a study of wisdom literature, and particularly the book of Proverbs. And wisdom literature is a term which might be a little foreign to us. So I'd like you to open your Bible to that list of the books of the Bible, books of the Old Testament. And what you find in your index here is the way the books are arranged in our English Bibles, and particularly the Old Testament. When this was translated into English and probably various other languages out of the Hebrew, we decided to change the order of most things in the Old Testament. First 5 books always remain the same. That's the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And that's the law. That's really the heart of the Hebrew Bible, is the law. And after the law, we have arranged what we call historical books. Roughly, they're the history of the Jewish people, as illustrated in Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, and so on. And then following the historical books, we have what we call poetry. And the books of poetry are Job through the Song of Solomon. That's our arrangement. Job is written in poetry, in poetic form. But we'll see later that it doesn't belong in that category totally, that its real intent is something different. Anyway, it's Job through the Song of Solomon. Then we have the 5 major prophets, Isaiah through Daniel. And then we have the 12 minor prophets. And we've attached the idea of major and minor to these books solely based on how long they are. The major prophets are major because they wrote a lot. The minor prophets wrote more concisely and wrote less, and so they called minor prophets. And they've also listed that in descending order of how long they are. So Isaiah is the longest prophet. And so we go down to Daniel. And then the minor prophets going right down to Malachi, which just has, I think, 4 chapters. So that was the English arrangement of the Old Testament. But it broke completely with what the Hebrews regarded as their Bible, the Old Testament. In the Hebrew division of the Bible, the law remains the same. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And incidentally, they still, in our English Bibles, they have English names or derived from the Greek. Deuteronomy just means the second giving of the law, which is really a summary of all the law in that final book. Genesis, beginnings, comes from the Greek word. Exodus comes from a Greek word, means the march out or the road out. And then Leviticus, they couldn't help themselves. That's the Levitical priesthood and all that they had to do. But after that, the Jews' division is different. After the law, we have the prophets divided into the former prophets and the latter prophets, which is more of a historical arrangement than our English Bible. And the former prophets are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Notice I didn't say 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, because the Jews don't divide those up. And then the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12, or minor prophets. And you notice that Daniel is missing from that list. There's a problem with Daniel. They did not regard some of these books as deeply inspired as others. And so we have the last section of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible, which is called the writings. It's a kind of etc. It's all the other writings that the Jews regarded as important and part of their canon. It's a religious poetry, which of course includes Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. Proverbs and Job are all written in Hebrew poetry. But Proverbs and Job belong to a different part of that. Then we have the 5 scrolls, Song of Solomon's, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. And a lot of these are not regarded as deeply inspired as the rest of the Old Testament. That's why they put in this collection. Daniel, for instance, is excluded because it has large sections in Aramaic, not Hebrew. In fact, the largest section of Aramaic writing is found in Daniel. And then Ezra and Nehemiah, because it dealt with the rebuilding of the temple and included a couple of letters obtained by Ezra to enable him to travel to the Holy Land and rebuild the temple. And because those letters were written in Aramaic, guess what? They shouldn't be in the Hebrew part of the Bible. And the same with Chronicles. Chronicles, because it's largely a repetition of Kings, is put in the writings. But what we're focusing on is 3 books that are found in the writings that are regarded as wisdom literature: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. Job uses the word wisdom a huge number of times. And even though it's a discussion between Job and his so-called friends, there's a lot of wisdom writing included in that, and especially when Job has his confrontation with God and learns that he doesn't know a lot of things that he should know. And so when we get to the writings, we're going to focus on the book of Proverbs. It's the longest of the writings, and it's unique. The writings are generally unique, but especially Proverbs itself, because it doesn't deal with theology. You don't get any great theological teaching in Proverbs. It's more secular than the other parts of the Old Testament. In other words, it deals with us in our everyday lives. And it deals with God as the center of all wisdom, the beginning of wisdom. Because God knows everything, and whatever we need to know can be found in God. How to lead our lives, especially. And so wisdom is meant for us to think about and study and learn how to live our lives. according to the order of God. And so it doesn't deal with things like politics and so on, although it does mention kings and how one should respect the king and so on. But there are a number of topics that are dealt with in Proverbs. The earlier parts of the book, up to chapter 9, are exhortations to seek for wisdom and understanding. Give it your attention. Wisdom is everywhere, and what we have to do is to open our minds to understand wisdom and see what it is that we need to learn and apply in our lives to live a good life according to the commandments of God. The authors of Proverbs, although the Proverbs are attributed to Solomon, in Proverbs 1 verse 1, it says, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. But he's not the only writer. And it's thought that although Solomon asked for wisdom and was granted wisdom by God and became the wisest man of his day, and probably wiser than all the wise men today put together. Although that was so, we also have included in the book of Solomon, in chapter 30, the word of Agur, an oracle. We have in chapter 31 the words of King Lemuel, the oracle, which his mother taught him. And then a section called the words of the wise in Proverbs 22. And so these are all included. So Solomon may have authored most of the Proverbs, but he collected Proverbs as well. You're never so wise that you don't need more wisdom, and you shouldn't look for more wisdom. And so, because of this, then, we find in the Proverbs a tremendous amount of information about the wisdom that we need. I'm going to give a rough outline, but we won't go into many details because we're going to then look at many parts of Proverbs, and I propose doing so in the form of a topical study. If you read through Proverbs, and incidentally, it's neatly arranged into 31 chapters, so you can read a chapter a day. But you might end up a little bit confused because the chapters very often work their way through several different themes in every chapter. And so you'll get a couple of verses on this topic and a couple of verses on another topic. And so reading through in the month, most months, and you can easily catch up the extra chapters, they're not very long, is probably not the way that's going to give you the best idea of the content. So we're going to choose topics and follow those. And the first topic, which will begin next week, Lord willing, will be fear, because it says fear God. And we need to look at what Proverbs considers to be fear. It's not a shaking awe or a shaking feeling that something dreadful is going to be happening to you. God is going to strike you or something like that. It's not that fear at all. The Hebrew word has instead the idea of a very deep respect for, an awe of God. Who cannot be in awe of God when you consider that He created the universe? You just need to look briefly at the universe through a telescope, any telescope, and you'll be amazed at what's out there. And God created it and put it in place. It is vast, and for one to keep all of that universe operating is amazing. And so we're in awe of God. and we respect God. And we need to recognize, because of our great respect for God, that He is the sum and substance of our life. Everything should be lived in God or in respect to God. The world, as we see it today, and if you follow the news at all, which is not something I advise you to do, it's a mess. Only in God do we find consistency. Only in God do we find order. Only in God do we find how to live a life that is going to be pleasing to Him and is going to be helpful to other people. Because the life of one who is obeying God and following God is one of service to other people. And that is where you find the greatest satisfaction and the greatest joy. Money cannot buy you that kind of joy. No amount of educational achievement can buy you that kind of joy. No amount of building can buy you that kind of joy. And so we find our greatest joy in obeying God. And so as the book begins, it ascribes everything to Solomon, which acknowledges that he was the wisest man that ever lived. In fact, people traveled thousands of miles to see Solomon and hear him proclaim his wisdom. And so it ascribes it to him. But in the first chapter, we see that wisdom, we need to approach wisdom with a spiritual attitude and receive it in that way. And the style of the book of Proverbs is unique. It is Hebrew poetry, which again is unique. It's not like our poetry where the end of each line or every other line has to rhyme in some way. It doesn't do that at all. And it's almost entirely, I think there are one or two exceptions, almost entirely consists of two-line sayings, or as the poetic world would call it, couplets. So everything's in two lines. And the first line makes a statement, the next line of the poem, or whatever you want to call it, either enlarges on that or gives a contrast or in some way expands your understanding of the first statement. So make a statement, enlarge on it, and say, and also, or it will provide a contrast so that you can grasp the idea in that proverb. And it's a style which is strongly encouraging. It encourages you to do this. This is the best way to go about whatever topic it's talking about. And it really is something that you can validate by looking around and seeing when it talks about marriage, it talks about raising children, it talks about being industrious, in other words, working, and not just sitting around and watching other people work, but get engaged in whatever you're doing. And the Proverbs recommends this, and it says, if you don't, this is going to be the result in some of the Proverbs which give the opposite. And so as we go through Proverbs, there are a lot of things that we look at that we'll recognize immediately. That's a good way to go about it. This is an intelligent approach to life. It's often addressed to my son as if this needs to be the kind of thing which every good parent advises his son and his daughter, of course. The Hebrews were very male-oriented. I'm sorry, that goes against the grain for today. But when we read in the Old Testament, for instance, the children of Israel, that's not the way the Hebrews put it. That's our English understanding. It always talks about the sons of Israel. It doesn't speak about the daughters of Israel. It was a very male-oriented society. And so we find that there, but despite that, we do find that there are female leaders. Deborah was a judge. And so, and one of the great heroines of the faith is, of course, Esther. But everything is kind of male-oriented, so that's why they say that you should instruct your sons. The first 6 verses, which I'd like to read for us from chapter 1, go this way. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, and to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the naive, to the youth knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. And that's how it begins. And you'll notice the style immediately, where it says in verse 2, to know wisdom and understanding, and then the next line in Hebrew, to discern the sayings of understanding. So you've got parallel words, to know or to discern. Wisdom and instruction, sayings of understanding. And very often that will be the clue to getting the deeper meaning out of each particular proverb. The fact that it's expressed 2 ways. And so the one way will help you to understand the other. There are also warnings about what is going to happen in our lives. Beginning at verse 8, it talks about the enticement of sinners and warns that there are going to be strong efforts to take us away from wisdom and to follow the way of sin. In fact, the wisdom is personified as a woman, beginning in verse 20. Wisdom shouts in the street, she lifts her voice in the square. In other words, wisdom is to be found everywhere, in the streets, in the square. As you go around, look at what's happening. And you will soon be able to see foolish mistakes that have been made and learn from those. So you have this woman who's named Wisdom, uses the feminine form in the Hebrew, and contrasted with that is in chapter 9, if you go across to 9 and begin at verse 13, you'll find the foolish woman, the woman of folly, verse 13 of chapter 9. I'm reading incidentally from the New American Standard Bible. I think it's the most accurate translation. It may not be the most beautiful translation. Some people say it's a rather wooden translation, but I think it's the most accurate and it's closest to the original languages. So here in 9:13, it talks about the woman of folly is boisterous, she is naive and knows nothing. And so she is given in contrast to the woman who is wisdom, who personifies wisdom. So you have two contrasting views of life. And we're warned to be aware of the danger of the woman of folly. So there's always foolishness that is being advocated as opposed to wisdom. And this is what Proverbs goes to great lengths to tell us about. And you look at people generally through Proverbs lens who are following God and centered on obeying him and doing what he requires, and then you will be given another picture of those who are following foolishness. And that's pretty well the world that we live in today. Those who are following God are following wisdom, and those who aren't are really being foolish in many ways. And that'll be well illustrated through the book of Proverbs. The nucleus of the book, the kind of heart of the book, all the wisdom gathered together, is found from chapter 10 to 22. So the first 9 chapters are a kind of introduction, strongly encouraging following wisdom, strong warnings against following foolishness. And you follow wisdom by looking at what God has put in order and how God wants the things to be done. There are lots of things in Proverbs: righteousness, wickedness, industry, or being involved in doing what you need to, laziness, and then wise speech and wild talk. Then you get to chapter 22. This is a very broad outline. When you get to chapter 22, you have some counsel which was apparently sought out by a delegation. We don't know where the delegation came from, but they appear to have come to look for advice. And we find these words: "Have I not written for you 36 sayings of counsel and knowledge, to make you know what is right and true, that you may give a true answer to those who sent you?" So somebody sent these guys to find out what true knowledge was from the Jewish people. And probably they had come on part of some king from somewhere. We don't know where, but we have to assume that from the way that this is set out. And in the section from 22 to 24, we find that in this section, the favorite form is 4 lines of Hebrew text for each of the sayings. Then there are a few leftover sayings or precepts in the remainder of 24, and then Proverbs 25 through 29 form a collection by the men of Hezekiah. So Hezekiah got men from his kingdom whom he regarded as wise, and asked them to make a collection of wise sayings. And in that section, many sayings which have similar ideas are collected together, unlike the rest of Proverbs, or the major part of Proverbs, where every chapter is just a mixture of various sayings. And then the words of Agur in chapter 30, and he is unknown apart from this chapter of the Bible, so we have no idea where he came from. And then finally the words of King Lemuel in Proverbs 31, which includes the famous eulogy of the woman. And it's what we call an acrostic. Every verse in this section from 10 to 31 starts with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet in order, from Aleph, Beit, Gimel, and so on, Every verse will begin with the next letter in the Hebrew alphabet. That's what's called an acrostic. And it is in praise of the worthy woman, and indeed a glowing praise that is given to her. And so included in all of the topics, and I did download a topical chart, and it covers 19 pages, and some topics only have one verse. Anxiety, there's only one verse for that. But some topics are covered at great length. There are many verses on anxiety, and many verses on hate, and many, many verses on righteousness, and then a lot of verses of various parts of the family. And so we're going to try to study topically. We won't include every verse on every topic. There are just too many topics to cover, even if you had a whole year-long class. But we'll just choose. I've chosen things that I think may be important to us: the fear of the Lord, the folly of the fool, righteousness. What does Proverbs say about righteousness? And then marriage and family, work, speech. There's a lot said about speech. If we could get a grip on our speech and only say things which build people up and are encouraging, then we would do a lot better than we're doing now. And there's the natural tendency to want to be a critic, to want to be a perfectionist and point out what's wrong with everybody else. Because that's a handy way of saying, I'm better than everyone else since I know better than most of the people. And you can always find something to criticize. I'm a person who's easy to criticize. Lots you can find that need fixing up in my life. And then a lot is talked about money. A lot is talked about those in authority, particularly in our society, and then wisdom regarding anger. Anger is one of the problems that we all face. We get angry, and when we are angry enough, it blinds our judgment, and we're not able to function properly. It can consume us entirely. And so those are the topics that I've chosen. I'd be willing to swap some of them out. I have prepared some of those sections already, but I'd be willing to swap some of them out if you found something that was particularly important to you. We could maybe include it with some of the other topics. But the problem we face is that we live in a world which is really the province of Satan. And he wants to pull us away from obeying God. That's his objective. He's very skillful at it. In fact, he began right when mankind began, you remember. Draw people away from God. And that's partly what Rex was talking about today. And so, Proverbs in the first chapter, beginning at verse 8, starts to give us an idea of what we're up against. It says, "Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching." There's several things you can learn from that if you just look at that particular verse. What do you learn from it? I'm asking you to wake up now and what do you learn from that? Who's responsible for teaching children? Is it the education department? Is it the Sunday school? Who's responsible? Parents, mother and father. You know, sometimes mothers will say, "You wait until your father gets home." and he'll put you straight. Verse 9, indeed they are a graceful wreath to your head and ornaments about your neck. What does that tell you about the value of your parents' instruction? Didn't you get anything from your parents?
What happens when you don't have really good parents?
Pardon?
What about when you don't have really good parents?
Well, you have to learn from that. This didn't work out too well. You've got friends, you look at their parents, and you say, oh. And so you learn about parenting from your parents, even when they didn't do a good job. And sometimes you learn what not to do. There are children who fear that their parents are going to divorce and leave them. And so it strikes terror into them. And they decide, I'm not going to do that when I get married. And so you learn from your parents. And what does good parenting do for a child? It turns them into what? People with a graceful wreath on their head. In other words, they become more attractive people. They become more admirable people because they were well trained. And our objective should be to launch children into the world who will be an asset to the world. And very often we're lumbered with kids who are just disrespectful, dishonest, lazy, dependent on others for everything instead of being able to support themselves. So the responsibility of parents is to put kids into the world who really make the world a better place to be in. And so, verse 10, my son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood, let us ambush the innocent without cause, let us swallow them alive like Sheol, even whole as those who go down to the pit. And so this illustrates all the ways in which people of the world are going to drag people away from God. And that's their objective. And they will do so in various ways. You don't know what you're missing. We're going to have a lot of fun. We're going to live a great youth, unlike you, restricted, restrained, and so on. And so they are very persuasive, and they want you to join. But we're also told that wisdom is widespread. Verse 20, wisdom shouts in the street, she lifts her voice in the square. At the head of the noisy street she cries out. At the entrance of the gates in the city she utters her sayings. What does that mean? What is he trying to get across? Do you actually find a woman named Wisdom shouting in the street? What is he trying to get across to us? Where are you going to learn wisdom? Well, how will you learn wisdom? Probably is a better way of putting it. You learn wisdom by observation. She's in the street, she's everywhere. But you have to be looking at her or looking for her. What is the best way of doing these things? What is the best way for me to live? And so one learns that from seeing perhaps the mistakes that people are making. and learning from them. I remember that there was a series of articles published about profit from my mistakes, and people would write about what they had done wrong and the results of doing wrong or going in the wrong direction or making the bad choices. And they did that to illustrate the better way of doing things and the better way of living our lives. And so this is wisdom. Do we want to be wise? I think a lot of times we settle in for the daily routine that we have become accustomed to, and we don't want to be bothered with having to learn anything more. I know enough, I'm getting along, but could I get along better? Could I be a better person? Could people find things from me that benefited them and blessed them? And do you bless somebody every day? I don't mean say bless you when they sneeze or whatever, but in some way, I hope to leave people feeling a little better because I've been there. You know, you can cheer a person up by smiling at them, and they will usually respond with a smile. You can make people feel better just by saying something encouraging, by being appreciative of what they're doing for you. Do you go into a supermarket and as you put all your items on the belt, you notice that the cashier is looking pretty miserable? And there are customers who can do that to them. And there are bosses who can do that to them. And so they're really not having a good day. Do you try to leave them with a little better day by smiling, saying something encouraging, and letting them know that you appreciate what they're doing? That all goes a long way to brightening their day. Do you brighten people's day, or do you respond with a glum look that makes them feel, oh, everything's miserable today? Have you never had a bad day? Anybody never had a bad day? Doesn't it help when somebody tries to be encouraging to you when you're having a bad day? And so we need to be that person who tries to encourage others. And observation goes a long way to making that possible. So that's a look at the two opposing forces, wisdom and foolishness. And foolishness is something that needs to be corrected in our children. Famous proverb says, foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. And children are born with foolishness bound up in them. And it says, the rod and reproof drives it quickly from them. So we have to watch out. The kind of default state is that the child is born and has foolishness in its heart. In other words, have you met a baby who is selfless? They want what they want now. Not in 2 minutes when you have time to prepare the bottle to feed them. They want it now. And so there is, when it talks about the rod and reproof, it's not talking necessarily about beating your child. It's just that just as you use a rod to direct cattle or sheep or whatever, discipline will point the child in the right direction. And so wisdom is needed to determine this and to begin to direct the child. A parent's object is to teach the child self-discipline. And if you can put out children who have self-discipline, then I think you've won the battle, and wisdom will begin to prevail. It's about time, if that clock is correct, which is just about it. Does anybody have any questions? We'll look at the fear of the Lord next week, Lord willing. Yeah, do you have a question?
Well, it's not a question. It's when you're talking about how people can have bad days, and I didn't think about this until someone actually posted it on Facebook. Kids can actually have bad days too. You know, just that kind of totally changed my mindset with Declan. You know, I have a 4-year-old, and so as a parent, I guess I never really thought of that. You know, but they still are human. So there is, you know, that is a possibility that they could just be having a bad day as well. It's not that, you know, they're necessarily out to, you know, get you or to totally defy you or something like that. Sometimes they just have bad days too.
Yeah. You can wake up with a little grumbling in your stomach, a little bit of a headache, and you just feel down. And you say to yourself, this is not going to be a good day, and you're prophetically correct. Very often it's just not a good day. It takes a lot of strength of will to say, well, I'm going to make it into a good day despite. And a little kid doesn't know how to do that yet. That's your job. Teach them how to have a better day. But yes, you have to make allowances for everybody. Well, that's it. Thank you very much.